So before I start painting everything, I wanted to make sure that the hood fit well and the rear valence fits as well. The hood was a bit tight, so I sanded off on each side a couple of mil just to make it fit a little easier after the paint buildup makes all the edges a bit thicker and it will still fit. So I just took out some sanding sticks and sanded on each side to make it fit a little bit better. As I mentioned during the unboxing, you can build this in a couple of different ways, and it also included the stock rear end. Now I preferred the look of that one, so I'm going to go with that instead of the exhausts on each side. Now some of you might not agree, that's totally fine. I prefer this look, so that's what I'm going for. Also during the unboxing I mentioned that the body has some nice panel lines all over, except for around the window trim. They are there, but not really. It's pretty much just a raised edge, and that's all you have to work with. So I took a piece of masking tape, put it on there to give it a bit better of a visual for me, then took out a super sharp hobby knife and cut out along the edge on which I wanted to create the panel line. This is the first cut that I make. It's a pretty deep cut with a knife, so I'm pretty steadily holding the knife, making sure that I create the line that I want to create, and I can then start carving it out carefully with a scribing blade. The same process for creating this panel line around the front windshield frame was done on each side as well. The rear one wasn't really as hard, so I just scrapped that out a bit and then moved on to doing all of the other lines around the doors, some of the fenders, and generally around the entire body. The scribing is all done, all of the panel lines are now nice and neat, and I can move on to removing some of the mold lines. These are lines that of course are not supposed to be there, thus I want to be removing them. I'm marking them off with a permanent marker to show me exactly where they are, and also have the marker help as a sort of guide coat, because once I start sanding it, the marker will slowly disappear, and so will the mold line. I'm starting off with some sanding sticks, removing the higher raised edges and the bulk of that mold line. This is about 320 grit roughly, and after that I will start refining it and removing those rougher scratches with some 600 grit sanding sponges, and also giving the entire body a nice scuff for the primer to stick to it properly. With the body now prepped and ready for primer, I can move on to blowing it off with some air through the airbrush just to remove any loose or remaining dust on the body itself, and can then slowly start building up the coats of primer. The first light coat of primer is on. I let it sit and cure for about 5 minutes in between coats, and then moved on to the second and third coat, pretty much the same way I did the first. Once the final coat of primer was on, I let it sit and cure for about 15 minutes before I started sanding it smooth with some 3000 grit sanding sponges. There were a couple of rough spots around the body in some of the tight areas, and also a little bit of dust here and there, so using that 3000 grit sanding sponge to get rid of that, and also any of the orange peel that might be in the primer to make it as smooth as possible for the color coats to lay down really nice and smooth as well. So before I started the build, I posted a community post with a poll in it to show which color I was going to use, and the vast majority chose for the green. Then I went for the second round of voting over to my Patreon page, and they also decided on the green. So green it is. I'm of course using this on all of the separate smaller parts and pieces for the body as well. So the mirrors are painted, the rear valence is painted, and other parts that need to be green are painted at the same time I'm doing the body. Then moving on from those smaller parts to the main body itself, blowing over it again, removing any dust that was left behind from the sanding, and also any other dust that might have fallen onto it, and going over those hard to reach, easy to forget spots first, before going over the rest of the body with a nice light first coat. This green is covering really nicely, but it's also really thin, so I need to be careful not to apply the coats too thick. I'm going slow and just building it up in a couple of layers with a thin coat each time. In between, I let it sit and dry for about 10 minutes, and after I apply a coat, another 10 minutes to go on to the third and final coat before it's entirely covered. After 3 thin, nice and even coats of the green, it is fully covered and I can let it sit and cure for about 60 minutes before I start applying the decals on each side. I applied a little bit of decal setting solution. This helps the decal stick a bit better, also slide into place, and also softens the decal as well to conform to the shape really nicely. It's not too aggressive, but it really helps out a lot. Once happy with the decal placement, I took out a cotton swab and gently rolled over the decal to remove any moisture from underneath and permanently seat it in place. And the second half for on the rear quarter panel was placed as well, and after that I applied the markers and did the other side too. Once they were all in place, I let them sit and cure and also helped it with a bit of heat from a hairdryer to dry a bit faster. The decals are all in place, so it's now time to make it all nice and glossy. Firstly, again blowing over the entire body with just air to remove the loose dust that is on it, and then moving on to a first light coat on the decals, although it's hard to reach easy to forget spots, and a general coat on the rest of the body as well. The first coat is on, so 5 minutes of cure time before I apply the second coat, a bit thicker than the first, trying to get it a bit more glossy but still not going on it too aggressively. After applying the second coat, another 5 minutes of cure time, and I also added a bit more thinner to the clear coat mixture just to make it a bit thinner and help it flow out even more, getting a nicer and glossier finish all over. And that's it. 3 coats of clear are on. It's nice and glossy. It does have a bit of dust on the sides and also on the roof. I can try to polish that out in a later stage, but I'm not sure if I will, as the entire finish is pretty good overall. I'm going to let it sit and dry for 2 to 3 days before moving on to masking it off, painting that front section on the top in a matte black or a metallic dark gray. And then of course the interior needs to be built, the chassis needs to be built, and we can move on to entirely finishing off this car.